Hello, and welcome to the Researcher Podcast, your regular look at the research that's making waves in the scientific community and the people behind it. My name is Joe Fenton, and I will be your host today. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Homero Zúñiga from the University of Vienna. Homero is the author of Personality Traits and Social Media Use in 20 Countries. How personality relates to frequency of social media use, social media news use, and social media use for social interaction. Homero, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for having me.
So, before we get into your paper, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your academic career so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm originally from Spain, and I pursue a PhD in Spain in political science. And a little after that, I moved to the US and I pursued another PhD in communication at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And once I finished my studies, I remained in the US where I got married and I had my first children there. So we moved down to Texas where I was a professor. And I also served as a research fellow at the Nieman Lab in Harvard. And more recently, I moved back to Europe here at the University of Vienna, where I also served as a research fellow at the CTIP in Princeton University. So that's my background. So I guess that my interest in research lies within the convergence of those 2 points, political science and communication. So anything that deals with technology and with politics and how things influence society, coming from those angles, I'm interested on that.
So you have 2 PhDs. I'm just wondering what motivated you to look at and study mass communication in the first place?
Well, my undergrad was in journalism. So when I was young, I thought that I was going to be a journalist in my life. And then the more I studied journalism and the field of communication, the more I grew that interest for learning about things and how things work and what were the effects of media on people and society. And I always had an interest in technology too, part of journalism, symbiotic relationship with technology as for how journalists perform their duties. So in the end, it just came little by little. I started to get more closely related to the aspects of doing research and less related aspects of performing as a journalist.
If I was to break this down further, what are your main interests surrounding technology and surrounding the use of social media?
Right. Well, I think technology and social media they're obviously very related as for how we use today devices and so on and so forth. But if it was not because of technology and how technology rapidly grew in the past 2 decades, we wouldn't have social media as we know it. First, technology and the internet allow for rapid communication and voice over internet protocols. People could all of a sudden talk and watch videos and do all these marvelous things because of the internet. And one of the aspects that it influences how people socialize, how we share information to each other and with each other, and not only from one to one, but ultimately from many to many and one to many and many to one. And that became all of a sudden social media, something that we all use to consume information, consume entertainment, and communicate with others all at the same time. So it's a very complicated amalgam of different aspects and mechanisms and effects that take place in social media. But the relationship with technology is quite obvious then.
Okay, and for those that may not be familiar with your area of expertise or multiple area of expertise, as we just learned, and for those that may not have read your most recent article, could you give us a brief overview of personality traits and social media use in 20 countries?
Sure thing. This paper is not the first incursion that myself and my colleagues, either back at the University of Texas or now at the University of Vienna, that we took a look to how personality traits related to consumption of social media. The first paper we ever published, it was with 2 of my former students back in Texas, now professors, Correa and Winsley, and we were interested in learning about whether or not personality traits would be related at all with how people consume social media. And we tested that with US data back in the day. I'm talking about 2010. It was one of the first papers ever published in the area, and it became notorious and is largely cited. So growing from that interest, with my co-authors of this piece, here at Vienna, but also, James Liu at Massey University, we actually collected data massively in over 20 countries. And we wanted to learn about these effects, not only based on the US or Eurocentric perspective, but what happened across the globe. We were fortunate enough to get the whole high quality data from 20 countries and check the same effects of personality traits may have on social media. And we advanced a few things. Drawing from what we learned from the first paper, we were interested in dissecting different effects of personality traits in different types of social media consumption. So social media in a more general term, like how much they use social media in their days, in their daily lives, but also with respect using social media purposefully to consume information, news, and public affairs, and to consume or better said, to interact socially with others in social media. So to spend time connecting with others and socializing rather than just consuming information. And that's what we did. And there you have the findings. There are very specific findings that work across all cultures. And then there are some nuances and differences depending on the country that you may want to pay a closer look.
So in your paper, you mentioned that the study of social media and personality traits is in its infancy outside of the United States. So I'm just wondering, why is this?
I think, it probably doesn't only happen or takes place with personality traits in social media. I think for the most part, many of the studies that take place and set the bar or a baseline as for how technology and not only technology, many other things will function in society. They take place in Western societies or even in the US when it comes to communication, for sure. So I think there's a dire need for social scientists to test our theories in different cultural contexts and political contexts. So that's one of the goals that we were able to achieve with this study, as we were able to check how things work in relation to personality traits and social media, not only in the US or UK or other European countries, but also in the countries such as Turkey or Ukraine or Chile or China, Estonia, so many different countries across the globe.
So in your paper, you discussed the big 5 personality traits. And I just want to ask you if these are completely set in stone. Do you think there could be either more of these personality traits added? Do you think we could get a 6th or a 7th? Or could they shrink? So could you have a big 4 personality trait?
Right. Well, for the most part, on the one hand, one could say they're very well established and set on stone. These big 5 personality traits have been around us for quite some time, and they're based on hundreds of items. In the 60s, they started to measure these personality traits, and they came up later on performing analytical tests and empirical tests that we were able to isolate 5 great dimensions, and that's why we talk about these big 5. Lately, there are some scholars who are pursuing or pushing the idea of more dimensions. There's a 6th dimension now, to see how altruistic someone might be, and personality traits that may be related to that altruism. So I think in the future, we might see some more dimensions, but for the most part, these are the very well established dimensions of the big 5. And I see space for improvement, but in reality, we don't change that much ultimately. Many of our personality traits will, for the most part, fall within these 5 dimensions.
Would you say that these personality traits are directly related to social media, or are they broader?
Yes, they are. They are related to social media. So, for instance, we would see that regardless of the country, if we take all the data all together, for these 20 countries, when someone reports higher levels of extraversion, they will use all social media across the board. They will spend more time in social media. They will consume more news in social media, and they will also tend to interact and socialize more in social media. So if you're extroverted, you're going to just do everything more. The same thing happens with the dimension of agreeableness or being conscientious. When people are very conscientious, they really spend time on making sure that everything works fine, and they take pride on finishing things up and they pay attention to little detail. They will also spend more time. Conversely, on the other hand, people who tend to be less stable or more neurotic, if you may, they will also tend to do all these things. The more stable you are, the more stable a person, an individual may be, the less time overall they will spend in social media, and the less time overall they will spend in social media consuming news and socializing. Whereas if you tend to be more neurotic, that will lend support to the notion of you spending more time across the board. Interesting enough, being open to new experiences have different effects. So if you're open to new experiences worldwide with the pool data, it will indicate that you will spend more time generally in social media. Someone who's open to new experiences and learning about new things, overall, they will spend more time in social media, perhaps seeking ideas or who knows, things related to this open-mindedness. However, they will spend less time consuming news and less time socializing with others. So that's an indication as well as they go differently. And that's overall. Once again, if you pay attention to individual countries, you might have different nuances and different effects. So maybe for one country, one of the things wouldn't work, or for one country, the effect of extraversion will be very strong, and in another country, it might be milder.
So in your paper, you argue that extroverts are more likely to use Facebook in order to gather their news, whilst those that are more conscientious would use Twitter. And I'm just wondering why this is. Because in my own mind, when I think about this, I cannot come to any kind of logical conclusion.
Right. So overall, we talk about the idea of social media as an amalgam of behavior, and the way we asked it just for the sake of minimizing measurement error was to just ask citizens across different cultures to think about the social media platform they use the most. Whereas there might be different effects in regards of a particular social media platform. So perhaps extroverts may use Facebook more to socialize, and the effect will be a little bit lower when it comes to Twitter because they don't socialize so much, but they consume more information in there, for instance. However, don't forget that the main effect is very similar. Those who are extroverted, they will use social media more, regardless of the platform. There's some research, although not in this particular piece, but other pieces that we've done and some other colleagues at different universities, that you might find different effects coming from Facebook or Twitter. So if you're interested in that, you can read other pieces out there. They're also interested in learning more about these nuances and these differences. And so we'll see for instance, some people will use Twitter to receive more information purposively versus Facebook, in which, although they are also exposed to news, they are exposed to news in a more incidental way due to their networks. So there are differences when it comes to platforms, but unfortunately, this paper, that's not one of the feasible goals, as it dealt with so many countries and so many differences. We were trying to gather more information holistically about social media at large.
So the data from this study was taken in 2015, and obviously the world has changed since then. And without putting too much of a political spin on it, we see Donald Trump in the White House, Brexit has occurred, there's evidence that some countries have interfered with other countries' elections via social media. And for me personally, and I'm not sure about generally, on my social media accounts, I've seen a lot more political and social activities. So with this in mind, I'm just wondering how the results of your study may have changed if we use data from the past 2 years.
That's a phenomenal question. I mean, that we will have to speculate and repeat the test. But I think over the years we've seen that the effect of personality traits on how people consume social media are very stable. So if I would have to make an educated guess, I would say that personality traits will relate very similarly today as for how people use social media. There might be differences on particular cases, like for instance, trust in social media may change a little bit, but not due to your personality traits, but rather due to other antecedents or other socio-political contexts. But when it comes to personality, that's one of the beauties of doing research on personality traits. That whatever it is that they end up predicting, it's a very stable type of behavior. So if I'm less stable, for instance, or a little bit more neurotic, I'm going to continue to use social media more for news, perhaps even more so now with Trump. But I don't think things will reverse. So I don't think that changes will be in a way that my personality traits now will predict something differently, but rather that it will emphasize or get stronger effects, things like that.
So looking at the data in this study, the Ukraine had the largest data set, whilst Korea had the smallest data set. And I'm just curious to know why this is.
That's all due to us. When social scientists attempt to collect survey data from any given country, you want to secure what we call generalizability or representation. That is, that the findings that you achieve may be generalizable to the rest of the population in a given country. So we have learned that to minimize the error and to be able to generalize information to the rest of society, you need to have at least over 1,200 people per country. That will do it for sure. Obviously, smaller countries like Malta, you might need just a few hundred people in there. But if it's a large population of millions of people, you might need just about 1,000 or 1,200 people to be sure that if it's correctly collected and randomized and so on and so forth, the data will be representative of the rest of the population. So that's what we should. We partner with Nielsen for this particular study, and we should to that goal, that objective, to have more than 1,000 people per given country. Now, since this is ultimately you are to you hope for the best, but it's hard to. You can't force people to reply surveys. So you try to do your best and get good representation and so on and so forth. But the difference in sample sizes is due to that. So maybe in a country, some people reply more than in another country. But we always attempt to achieve high representation and generalizability. So that's why we want at least a few hundred people.
So before we move on to the impacts of this particular paper, I just want to ask you why minorities and females tend to use social media more. Could you define this to either a personality trait, or is there something wider?
Yeah, no, it's we found out why this is a recurrent finding that we have in many different data sets. So in my teams, either in Texas or here in Vienna, every time we collect data, that's one of the things that comes once and again. And it's a systematic finding, which is minorities will tend to use more social media, and for practically everything, in general terms, in terms of time, but also to consume news and to interact with others. And theoretically, I can speculate theoretically as for why I think this takes place. And in one of my papers, we elaborate on this for a couple of paragraphs. But if you take, for instance, what others have discussed in the literature of journalism, one of the recurrent arguments for minorities with respect to journalism is that they don't feel they are quite well represented. So, for instance, a particular TV channel or a newspaper or news on TV, they might feel they're in the U.S. If I take as an example, this white news produced by white people for white audience. And this has been discussed in the past in the literature many times. And I think that will be part of explanation, or that could be part of explanation. Minorities may tend to feel that they are not very well represented in general mainstream media. So they may feel that they find a broader set of information and characteristics they feel is better for them in social media. So that's probably why they end up using social media more, and they consume more news in social media, and they interact more in social media. Because if you think about it, it may be a means for them to overcome hurdles to achieve informational goals. So it's a constant in our data, not only in this data set, but all the data sets that we have collected in the US. And finding is always very similar. Since for the past decade, minorities tend to use social media more than whites.
I have to agree with your speculation, and I hope that there will be an academic paper produced soon that will address this issue. And I'm sure that will be an extremely interesting read. So moving on to the impacts of this piece, I just wanted to ask you, what impact do you reckon this paper could have in either the academic world or the real world?
I hope, I can only be hopeful. You can never predict how a paper or a piece of study is going to do. You always tend to think that when you write a paper, you do it because you think it's going to be influential, it's interesting, but then the larger academic community ends up judging that and citing the paper. I think it will be well cited, and I'm hopeful that it may serve as a stepping stone for other studies to pay more attention to differences when it comes to different cultures and contexts. We definitely need more of those. We need more studies that take into account different countries in different geographical places and with different social-political contexts. Unfortunately, it's very expensive to collect data such as this one. We rely on a large grant that we receive. Otherwise, it's just very hard to collect data from many different places at once. And as for the finding itself, I think the findings are very interesting, and I just hope that more theory will be tested and created because of this finding, and people may use them in their own studies. I think one of the obvious next steps, is to start paying attention to the things that we discussed earlier. Joe, you mentioned too, when you discuss like differences from platforms. Is it the same on Twitter or here or there? I think there will be things that we will have to pay attention to when it comes to personality traits and different aspects of social media. Perhaps not so much about platforms. I think a good hint on doing impactful research in the future is, rather than platforms, what they are doing with those platforms. So I think personality traits may be very consistent in explaining that if you're extroverted, you will consume news on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and so on and so forth. But I think rather than paying attention on the platform itself, I think we have to develop new theories and be creative as for thinking what else is there that it can predict. So, for instance, if I am very stable, I might use just social media to consume information. But when I'm neurotic or unstable, maybe I'm just, tapping on my ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend to see all the time what they're doing. So unhealthier behaviors when it comes to social media. Those are, I think, the little things that we need to be paying attention in the future, rather than just dividing platforms, paying attention to behavior.
And so this paper was published in a well-regarded journal. But I just wanted to ask you what the whole process of publishing is like, just to get your thoughts on publishing in general.
The process itself, well, this probably needs a different conversation altogether. But it's a recurrent argument and discussion in the academia. Some people are advocating for open sources, that is, that you publish and is open to everyone, not only the academic community, but anyone who wants to read about them. And for the most part, we all advocate for that. But we are trapped in a system in which you want to publish in the best journals because for professors or early career professors, they'll be eventually judged in where they publish, to promote. So when you're, the stability of your job and your salary and so many other things and your reputation depends on these publications, you want to publish in those journals that are the best journals in your field. And those journals, ultimately, they are controlled by a handful of publishers. Oxford, Routledge, Elsevier, the Dutch company. So in the end, there's a handful of companies that take care of a business. And if you think about it, these journals are run by professors. We all are serving as editors of the journals or boards or members of the academic boards in the journals, and we review for them. And we review for free because it's part of our duties in academia for the sake of the field and the sake of knowledge. And we publish for free. So in the end, it's a free labor all around. And then they charge thousands of dollars to our own universities that they pay for us to have access to it. So if you think about it, it's a system that is, on the one hand, very awkward, but on the other hand, very necessary because we all need to publish in the best journals. I like few journals that ultimately have come to become leading journals in our discipline, and they're open. Like, for instance, the one that I just mentioned earlier, the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication. It's a completely open journal. You can go to the link of the journal right now and to the website and read any paper for free. The International Journal of Communication, which is based in the University of Southern California, is published for free and it's open access. And there are many journals that they're adopting that. I think Sage and Elsevier and the Oxfords and so on and so forth ultimately will become a little bit more open-minded to this system. They offer now a hybrid possibility of making your publication open, but you have to pay a steep fee to do it. So sometimes if you have a large grant, you may be able to pay for your publication to be freely available to everybody. So you see that this is an ongoing conversation and it doesn't have an easy, straightforward response or solution.
And again, it goes back to this whole idea of publish or perish.
Absolutely. I think that is a sentence that is still valid today.
Yeah.
Publish or perish. And we all have to publish in the best outlets and compete for the best publications to place our studies in there. And it's very hard to publish in those journals and the acceptance rate is quite low. So, it's a sentence that I think is still completely valid. Publish or perish. And depending on where you publish, your job and your work and the impact of your work may be quite different. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. I think the system is imperfect.
So obviously you've had a very successful career. You've moved around from university to university. You've got 2 PhDs. So I'm just going to ask you, who's influenced your academic work the most and also impacted you as a person?
Oh, wow. That's a very interesting question. Obviously, I'm influenced to a large extent by the Wisconsin, what I call the Wisconsin School, where I got my communication PhD degree. My advisor, Davansa, he was a fundamental piece in a fundamental role in my development as academic. Also colleagues that they're now professors, but back at the time were students like me, my cohort, like Professor Hernando Rojas, he's Colombian, but he's a professor now also in University of Wisconsin. Or Jaho Cho, he's a professor at the University of California now. We studied together and I learned a lot of statistics from him as well. So I've been influenced by my cohorts and my advisor and my mentors. And then academically speaking, also my work is influenced by the people I read. Obviously, and most of us, if I dare to state, we're nobody if we were not just standing in the shoulders of giants, right? So I learned from others who have paved the ground for me to continue to work and learn. Lance Bennett, Verba, Maxwell McCombs. There were many colleagues out there actually that I couldn't cite them all. If I started saying names, they would probably get mad at me because I didn't mention them. But they're from whom I learn, and I continue to learn from them every day. And not only people who are well established. I continue to learn. That's part of our job, and that's part of why I love this life so much. I continue to learn from colleagues and junior and senior alike. I love my lab that I discuss and work with people who are starting or they are postdocs and they get to become great influential people on their own, like my former student in Texas, Sebastián Valenzuela. He's a very well-known scholar today. Or more recently, one of my postdocs here at the University of Vienna, Brian Wicks, who's a professor now at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and he's doing phenomenal work and a bright young man, and he'll become very famous eventually. So that's part of why I love this life, that you keep constantly discussing and working with bright people all the time.
That's a really, really beautiful way to put it, because I don't think anybody else has given this piece of advice so far. And I guess you can use this advice in every single aspect of your life, not just in academia. So my next question revolves around productivity and academic productivity. So I'm just wondering if you've got any advice or tips to help increase other people's academic productivity.
Well, my tips have worked for me, but it might not be a good tips for anyone else. But for me, I think I've become very structured in my time. So we meet once a week with the Media Innovation Lab that I direct in Vienna. We meet every week for 3-4 hours, and that gives ground to establishing what we need to do, the homework for the rest of the week. And we are very independent. All the people who work with me and collaborate with me, we're all very independent in advancing things on our own, and then we get together and we discuss it. Setting some time to write is important, so you can and to run analysis and move on with the studies. Obviously, that takes time. So I try to also select the teaching in such a way that it doesn't spread out massively throughout the week. So I can teach one in 2 days, and then I have more time to rest of things. And then Fridays, I devote Fridays most of the time just to read papers and perform reviews. I'm part of over 20 editorial boards, so I constantly have pieces and studies that I need to give feedback to. So Friday became my reading day, and every Friday I devote the entire morning to just read papers and finish reviews. So as you see, it's a structure, but this by no means that it's a successful structure for everybody. I guess that everyone will have their own ways. But that's how I came to do things for my own sake.
Okay, and so for my last question, and probably one of my most favourite questions to ask, is advice for either a PhD or an early career academic. What would you say to them?
I would try to tell them to enjoy the ride, because if you don't enjoy what you do, you're not going to succeed. And I know that the field is becoming more pressing, publisher Paris, and too many demanding issues to take attention to, and be a great teacher at the same time, of course, and socialize and all these things. In the end, it might become too daunting for early career professors. But ultimately, if you enjoy what you're doing, you're going to do research and you're going to publish great work. So I would just tell them to try to enjoy the ride and work with others. That would be my advice. But as I said, I don't have a magic explanations as for how things work. Also, perhaps to be protective of time as much as they can. I know that when we start our careers, you want to collaborate and you want to help so much the department, the university, society. You want to give every talk possible. You want to help everyone. But ultimately, you need to set time aside so you can move your own research forward.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, that's just all we got time for today on the Researcher podcast. We've been joined by Homero Zúñiga from the University of Vienna. Homero, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure to be with you, Joe. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing the podcast somewhere.
And thank you for listening, everyone. Until next time. You've been listening to the Researcher podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. You can also follow us online at www.researcher-app.com. Or, alternatively, you can drop me an email at joseph.fenton@researcherapp.com. Researcher is free to use on iOS, Android, or on your web browser. And if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to leave us a review.